The Labor Theory of Value by Red Star, San Francisco. The key to understanding the nature of the capitalist economy, according to Marx, lies in the understanding of the nature of the commodity. At a high level, a commodity is something that is useful and that is produced in order to be exchanged for a different kind of commodity. So what is and what is not a commodity? Parents who make bread to feed their family are not producing commodities, but bakers who produce bread to sell on the market are producing commodities. Marx points out in Capital that commodities have not existed in all human societies. Commodities were virtually absent in very early communal societies, and instead members would share the wealth with one another or redistribute it by giving gifts to each other. They did not produce things in order to exchange them with other members of their community. For example, an elder of a tribe might teach a youth how to fish, but expect nothing in return. As societies became more complex, commodities became more prevalent. Capitalism is unique in that commodities entirely dominate the economy. Everything seems to have its price. Even something as essential as teachers expect to be paid and will refuse to teach without compensation. Once the economy is overtaken by commodities, things that people never imagined could become commodities finally succumbed. In The Poverty of Philosophy, Marx offered this description. Finally, there came a time when everything that men had considered as inalienable became an object of exchange, of traffic, and could be alienated. This is the time when the very things which till then had been communicated but never exchanged, given but never sold, acquired but never bought, virtue, love, conviction, knowledge, conscience, etc., when everything, in short, passed into commerce. It is time of general corruption, of universal venality, or, to speak in terms of political economy, the time when everything, moral or physical, having become a marketable value, is brought to the market to be assessed at its truest value. Let's circle back to the definition of a commodity. A commodity is defined as having both a use value, meaning it has to be useful to someone other than its owner, and having an exchange value, meaning that someone else must be willing to give up something they possess in exchange for it. An article without any use value does not qualify as a commodity because no one will be willing to exchange something for it. The commodity's exchange value amounts to how many commodities of a different type a person can exchange for this commodity. For example, if a jacket can be exchanged for 5 loaves of bread, the exchange value of a jacket amounts to those 5 loaves. The jacket could also be exchanged for 1 table, then the exchange value of the jacket is also 1 table, and so on and so forth. Now, it's important to note that the use value of a commodity and its exchange value are distinct. The use value of a commodity is something subjective. One person might find a commodity far more useful than another person, but the exchange value of a commodity has an aura of objectivity. 2 bicycles might be exchanged for 1 sofa, regardless of how much use the 2 people engaged in the exchange find in these particular commodities. The question then arises, what is the determining factor underlying the quantity in which the commodities are exchanged? Why do 2 bicycles equal 1 sofa in this exchange? The question takes us to the heart of the labor theory of value. Sofas and bicycles must have something in common in order to be placed in this equation. There is little in common with the physical qualities of bicycles and sofas, though. All commodities are the products of labor, and they have that property in common. Even though a specific kind of labor might be involved in the production of a specific kind of commodity, still, all commodities embody an expenditure of human energy and have this abstract labor in common. An object of use has a definite amount of exchange value because a specific amount of labor is required to produce it. If a sofa requires 4 times the amount of labor to produce than a bicycle, then the sofa, all other things being equal, will exchange for 4 bicycles. Though we should be careful, this does not mean the actual amount of time it took to produce something, because that would imply that by slowing down the labor process, one could increase the amount of labor embodied in the product and in this way make it more valuable. Instead, it is a matter of socially necessary labor time at a particular stage in history. If someone takes 4 hours to produce something that generally only requires 2 hours of labor, the article is still only worth the equivalent of 2 hours of labor. The amount of socially necessary labor time required to produce an article is historically relative. For example, when power looms were introduced into the process of weaving, the amount of time required to produce a specific amount of cloth was roughly cut in half. Today, thanks to computers, we can compute the answer to a complex mathematical equation in a matter of seconds, whereas previously it took hours. Exchange value of a commodity refers to how many other commodities it can be exchanged for. A chair might be exchanged for 10 loaves of bread, or 3 jackets, or 2 stools, etc. The number of each of these commodities represents the chair's exchange value. The value of the chair is the socially necessary amount of labor time required to produce it, which is measured in minutes, hours, and days. Value, or labor time, is the determining factor of a commodity's exchange value. If one article requires twice the amount of labor time to produce as a second article, then the first article will exchange for 2 of the second article, so that the amount of labor time is equal on both sides of the exchange. In order to facilitate the exchange of commodities, humans created a special commodity: money. The value of a piece of gold is established on the same basis as any other commodity, the amount of socially necessary labor time required to produce it. Because of the substantial amount of labor time contained in gold and silver, and because the metals are easily divisible into small units, precious metals such as these were ideally suited to serve as money. They were particularly useful when one person wanted to buy a commodity from a second person, but did not possess any commodities that the second person wanted. Money allows a person to sell a commodity to one person and use the gold acquired in the transaction to buy a commodity from a third person. The amount of gold that a commodity commands on the market, then, is referred to as its price. Eventually, in order to facilitate an even greater circulation of commodities, paper currencies were introduced. A particular type of paper money was stipulated as representing a specific amount of gold. Moving on from exchange, let's think about what creates value. Only labor creates value. Machines and tools do not create it, even though they allow the worker to become more productive. A part of the machine's value is transferred to the commodity they help produce, but even that value transferred comes from the labor required to produce the machine. So let's think of an end-to-end example. Suppose we're making a commodity such as linen. We create it over the course of 8 hours with the help of an instrument or tool. Let's say also that the cotton that serves as the raw material for the production of the linen embodies 4 hours of labor time required to harvest it. Imagine at the end of the day, our tool we've been using to create the linen has been completely used up and must be replaced the next day. This tool was created with 2 hours of labor. Since the tool is a necessary component of the labor process, the labor required to produce it must be factored in as part of the labor time required to produce the linen altogether. Consequently, the total labor time embodied in the linen is equal to the 4 hours required to produce the raw materials, 8 hours that were expended during the workday to produce the linen, plus the 2 additional hours required to produce the instrument. The total value of the commodity is 14 hours of labor time. This same principle applies if the type of implement used in the labor process is a machine instead of a tool. Suppose at the beginning of the day, the raw materials that are to be transformed into a final product embody 60 minutes of labor. And suppose by running a machine, a worker could produce 60 commodities in a 10-hour day. Imagine the machine wears down and must be completely replaced after 100 days. And finally, suppose the machine itself required 100 hours of labor time to produce. Without taking into consideration the value transferred from the machine, each commodity would contain 10 minutes of labor time performed by the worker, plus an additional 1 minute of time contributed by the raw materials. According to our stipulations, the machine would lose 1 hour of its value in each 10-hour workday. That means each of the 60 commodities produced in the course of the day would contain an additional minute of labor time contributed by the machine. Each commodity would then have a total of 12 minutes of labor time. Although the examples might be a little hard to follow at first, there is seemingly a simplicity to the labor theory of value because of its apparent logic. Basically, articles containing equal amounts of labor time are exchanged for each other. But still, there are wild, often unpredictable forces that underlie this process of exchange. In a situation where supply has risen while demand has remained the same, the people who produce the supply are forced to compete with one another for buyers. In such a situation, they might be forced to lower the price of what they're selling below its value in order to sell it. Or conversely, if supply suddenly drops so that there are far fewer of that item in relation to demand, then buyers would be forced to compete with one another to get that type of item. In that case, the people who produce the item could raise their prices well above the item's value and still be assured of its sale. If something like this happens, and the price of something rises well above the value, then other members of the community might be tempted to move into that business in order to take advantage of the windfall. And then when there are too many people who produce that item, the supply exceeds demand and once again its price falls. Supply and demand, consequently, are the unpredictable variables that enforce the relation of socially necessary labor time in the exchange of commodities. When there is overproduction, the exchange value or price of a particular commodity falls. When there is underproduction, the exchange value or price rises. This is assuming that demand has remained constant in both cases. Over extended periods of time, and in the midst of these wild fluctuations, however, the average price of a commodity corresponds to the socially necessary labor time required to produce it, or its value. Under capitalism, this fluctuation of supply and demand is either exploited or used to pit people against each other. Everyone strives to get the best deal for themselves, either as a buyer or a seller. People are forced, above all, to look after their own welfare instead of sitting down and calculating the needs of society as a whole. Instead, people focus on margins or opportunities, which can often lead to overproduction or underproduction of a particular commodity. When overproduction occurs, people are thrown out of work and must seek employment in another line of business. They might have to leave their community and loved ones behind and travel far distances before finding work again. When the underproduction occurs, consumers cannot access the various things that they need or must pay a highly inflated price for them. Capitalism relies on the blind forces of supply and demand to forge some kind of crude correlation between production and people's needs. Capitalism exhibits this wild disjointedness as it lurches in one direction and then another to make wrenching corrections. This is its normal mode of operation. The rare exception exists where production exactly corresponds to demand. We could instead be carefully tailoring production to meet these needs and put conscious human reason in control. Until we collectively manage our economy, we're at the whim of these various blind forces.